April 23, 1946. Fulda, American Occupation Zone, Germany. The radio crackled with static. Then voices, desperate, fractured German syllables piercing through the white noise. Sergeant Robert Harrison pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, his fingers hovering over the transmission log he was supposed to be filling with military communications only. Outside the abandoned postal station he had commandeered, spring rain hammered against windows that still bore spiderweb cracks from artillery fire 8 months prior. On his makeshift desk, 3 ammunition crates stacked beneath a salvaged door, lay 17 photographs of missing children, their edges worn soft by desperate fingers. He shouldn't have been here. Not officially. This building was designated for storage, not for a 32-year-old former postal clerk from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to run an unauthorized missing persons bureau. But 3 hours ago, Frau Schmidt had collapsed at his Jeep, and Harrison had seen something in her eyes that made every regulation seem suddenly, profoundly irrelevant. The war had ended, but its cruelest legacy was just becoming visible. The invisible catastrophe. By spring of 1946, Germany existed in a state of human chaos that defied comprehension. 12 million displaced persons wandered the occupied zones, refugees, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, ethnic Germans expelled from eastern territories. The numbers were so vast they became abstract, meaningless. 12 million. The entire population of New York State, untethered and drifting. But Corporal Michael O'Brien from Chicago understood the mathematics differently. He understood it the morning a woman fell to her knees before his Jeep in the ruins of Kassel, a photograph clutched in her trembling hands. 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 11, last seen in Dresden during the firebombing, February 13, 1945. 14 months of silence, 14 months of not knowing if her children had burned, suffocated, been crushed beneath collapsing buildings, or somehow, impossibly, survived. "Bitte," she whispered. "Please." The only word she needed. O'Brien had been trained to operate a radio, maintain supply lines, process requisition forms. He had not been trained for this, for the weight of a mother's hope pressed into his calloused hands like a grenade without a pin. He took the photograph. He had no authority to do so, no official channel to pursue. But he had a radio, a Jeep, and 18 bases within transmission range. He found those children in 4 days. They had been living in a converted gymnasium in Nuremberg, registered under their mother's maiden name, in a relief organization's files that cross-referenced with nothing. Discoverable only because O'Brien spent 3 nights transmitting descriptions to every American base in Bavaria, and because Private James Chen in Nuremberg happened to be dating a German woman who volunteered at that gymnasium and recognized the description of a 9-year-old girl with a distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. When O'Brien drove that mother to Nuremberg, 187 kilometers, unauthorized use of military vehicle, falsified travel documents, and watched her children run toward her across the gymnasium floor, he understood something the regulations did not. The war had destroyed more than buildings. It had shattered the fundamental human network of knowing where your family was. And American soldiers, with their radios and jeeps and communication systems built for destruction, possessed the only tools capable of repairing it. The network emerges. Lieutenant David Cohen noticed the pattern in May, a former investigative journalist for the New York Herald Tribune. Cohen had spent the war writing intelligence reports and psychological operations materials. Now he was processing routine communications traffic and seeing something unexpected. American soldiers across the occupation zone were using military radio frequencies to transmit descriptions of missing persons. It was completely unauthorized. It violated protocol. It tied up communication channels needed for official business. It was also the most effective humanitarian operation anyone had yet devised. Cohen, who had a journalist's instinct for important stories and a bureaucrat's understanding of how systems actually worked, did something either brilliant or career-ending, depending on which superior officer you asked. He organized it. He created a network of 23 soldiers at different bases, each responsible for checking hospitals, displaced persons camps, refugee centers, and local administrative records in their sector. They developed codes, innocuous-sounding radio transmissions that actually contained descriptions of missing persons. They shared information through a mimeographed newsletter disguised as routine administrative updates. They called it Operation Compass. Officially, it didn't exist. By July, Operation Compass had facilitated 147 family reunions. By September, 412. The numbers climbed because the soldiers discovered something the official relief agencies, overwhelmed and understaffed, could not replicate: speed and coverage. A description transmitted at 0800 hours could reach 23 bases by 0900. Local checks could begin by noon. Matches could be confirmed by evening. Private first class. Samuel Torres drove a Jeep 219 kilometers through a thunderstorm to deliver a 9-year-old boy to his grandmother in Frankfurt. He arrived at 0200 hours, drenched, the boy asleep against his shoulder. The grandmother opened her door, saw her grandson, and made a sound Torres would remember for the rest of his life. Not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something older than language. "Worth the reprimand?" his sergeant asked later. Torres didn't answer. The question was absurd. The detective work. Finding the missing required detective skills none of these soldiers officially possessed. They learned. Sergeant William Bradford, a former insurance investigator from Hartford, developed a methodology. Start with the last confirmed location. Check hospital admission records. Many kept paper files even after bombings, stored in basements overlooked by overwhelmed staff. Cross-reference with Red Cross registration lists, though these were chaotic, often duplicated, sometimes using variant name spellings. Check military prisoner of war records, because some displaced persons had been conscripted into last-ditch German military units. Check death registers, because sometimes knowing was better than not knowing. Check school enrollment records in displaced persons camps. Check employment rosters at reconstruction sites. Check soup kitchen sign-in sheets. Check the informal notice boards that appeared in every refugee center, covered with handwritten notes and photographs, hope crystallized into paper. Most importantly, ask. Talk to camp administrators, relief workers, local residents. Someone always knew something. A woman who remembered a family with a distinct dialect. A relief worker who recalled processing a child with a particular medical condition. A local baker who noticed a customer using an unusual first name. The case of Frau Schmidt, the woman whose collapse at Harrison's Jeep had started all of this, became legendary among the network. She was searching for her husband and 2 daughters, lost during the Dresden bombing. The last address she had was a street that no longer existed, incinerated so completely that its rubble had been bulldozed into the Elbe River. Harrison started with hospital records in Dresden, then expanded to every hospital within 200 kilometers. Nothing. He checked prisoner of war camp records. Herr Schmidt had been 43 when last seen, potentially draft age. Nothing. He sent descriptions to all 23 Operation Compass bases. Nothing for 2 months. Then, Private Chen in Nuremberg sent a message. Bavarian refugee camp, translator position, man-matching description, mentioned Dresden, mentioned 2 daughters in camp school. Harrison drove Frau Schmidt to Bavaria himself, 412 kilometers. They barely spoke during the 8-hour journey. What was there to say? Hope was too fragile to examine. The camp gate, gray buildings that had once housed a labor factory, fences, guard towers now empty, and walking toward them, moving slowly like a man who had learned not to trust joy, Herr Schmidt. He stopped 10 meters away, stared. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Frau Schmidt said his name once. Ernst. He crossed those 10 meters in 4 running steps. Their daughters appeared minutes later, sprinting from the camp school, and Harrison watched as a family that had been scattered across 500 kilometers of destroyed Germany reconstituted itself through tears and repeated disbelieving touches. Hands on faces, confirming reality, confirming survival, confirming presence. 27 soldiers were watching. 11 were crying. Harrison put this detail in no official report. Some truths were too important for paperwork. The Wall of Hope. At the base in Gießen, someone, accounts vary on who, pinned a photograph to a bulletin board in the mess hall. Photograph of a young woman, age approximately 25, last seen in Hamburg. Distinctive scar on left hand from childhood burn. Below it a handwritten note. Information to Sergeant Martinez. By the next morning, 7 more photographs had appeared. Within a week, the entire bulletin board was covered. Within 2 weeks, they had expanded to a second board, then a third. They called it the Wall of Hope, and it became something more than a missing persons registry. It became a physical manifestation of collective grief and determination. Refugees began arriving at the base gates, asking permission to see the wall. At first, soldiers turned them away. Civilians couldn't enter military facilities. Then someone, probably Captain Richard Foster, who would later receive a formal reprimand for it, made a decision. Every Saturday, 0900 to 1600 hours, refugees could enter under escort to view the wall. Thousands came. They walked slowly along the boards, studying faces. When they recognized someone, they would tell the soldiers who would record the information, transmit it through the network. The wall became a central node in an improvised information system that spanned the occupation zone. Young Greta Hoffman, age 14, found her missing aunt's photograph on the wall. Her aunt had been in a hospital in Stuttgart, recovering from typhus, unable to communicate her location, because she'd been delirious for 6 weeks. The hospital had minimal records. No one had known where she was. Greta saw the photograph, said a name. Within 3 days, her aunt was located. How many reunions originated at that wall? The records are incomplete. Many soldiers kept no records at all, knowing their activities violated regulations. Conservative estimates suggest at least 800 connections made through the Wall of Hope between June 1946 and December 1947. The price of mercy. This work was not free. It demanded time, resources, and risk. Soldiers spent off-duty hours maintaining the network. They used military fuel for unauthorized trips. They falsified travel documents and vehicle usage logs. They tied up radio frequencies needed for official communications. Some faced disciplinary action. Private Torres received a written reprimand for his 200-kilometer midnight journey. Sergeant Bradford was threatened with court-martial for accessing medical records without authorization. Most commanders looked the other way. Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer at Gießen, knew perfectly well what was happening at his base. He knew about the Wall of Hope, knew about the Saturday visits, knew his soldiers were running an unauthorized humanitarian operation, using military resources. His official position, ignorance. His unofficial position, expressed to Captain Foster over whiskey one evening. If anyone asks, I know nothing. If they don't ask, keep doing it. Some commanders were less sympathetic. Major Philip Thornton at Frankfurt ordered the Wall of Hope there dismantled, called the entire operation a disgraceful waste of military assets. His soldiers waited 2 weeks, then quietly resumed. Using a warehouse off base, soldier-funded. Thornton discovered it, issued another order. They moved again. You cannot order compassion to stop. You can only force it underground. The anatomy of transformation. These soldiers had not entered Germany as humanitarians. They had entered as conquerors, shaped by years of propaganda depicting Germans as fanatical enemies. They had seen combat, lost friends, developed the necessary psychological armor to function in war. Then they saw the refugees. Corporal Daniel Murphy from Boston had fought through the Ardennes, survived the Battle of the Bulge, developed what his sergeant delicately called a pronounced dislike of Germans. Murphy volunteered for occupation duty, expecting to administer a defeated enemy, enforce rules, maintain order. 3 months into occupation, Murphy was using his weekend passes to drive displaced persons across zones, reuniting families. What happened? The transformation began with specificity. War allowed you to hate abstractions, the Germans, the enemy, the Nazis. But it's psychologically difficult to hate Frau Hoffmann, age 64, who shows you a photograph of her grandson, missing since the bombing of Hamburg, who tells you in broken English that he would be 8 years old now if he's alive, and who looks at you with eyes that contain no hatred, only exhaustion and hope. You can hate Germans. You cannot hate grandmothers searching for grandchildren. The transformation continued through the details of suffering. Numbers were abstract, 12 million displaced, but specific suffering was not abstract. The young mother in the Fulda camp who rationed her food to ensure her 3 children ate, who was slowly starving with a smile on her face so her children wouldn't worry. The old man who walked 17 kilometers every day between 2 displaced persons camps because his wife was in one and his daughter in another, and the bureaucracy wouldn't consolidate them. The teenage girl who served as translator for her entire camp because she'd studied English in school before the war destroyed her city, who worked 14-hour days without complaint, who was so thin her wrist bones looked like they might pierce her skin. These were not abstractions. These were individuals, and individuals demand moral response. Some soldiers resisted. We didn't start this war, they argued. Why should we clean up their mess? But most discovered that moral accounting wasn't satisfying. Yes, Germany had started the war. Yes, Germans bore responsibility for tremendous evil. And yes, helping a separated family find each other was still the right thing to do. Both truths could coexist. The transformation completed through action. Once you've driven 200 kilometers to reunite a child with family, you've changed. You've declared through action that individual suffering matters more than collective guilt. You've chosen a specific good over an abstract justice. You can't unchoose that. The case of Michael O'Brien, Corporal O'Brien, the soldier who started it all, who took that first photograph from a desperate mother in Kassel, almost didn't survive to help anyone. He'd been wounded 6 months before the war ended, during the Rhine crossing in March 1945. Shrapnel from an 88mm shell, pieces lodged in his abdomen and right leg. He'd been captured by German forces during the confusion of the assault, taken to a makeshift field hospital, expected to die. He remembered the moment of capture with crystalline clarity. German soldiers, exhausted and young, so young some looked 16, half carrying him away from the riverbank. He remembered thinking this was how it ended, wounded and prisoner, bleeding out in enemy hands. Then a German doctor, older man, civilian clothes stained with blood from a dozen previous patients, examined him, looked at the shrapnel wounds, looked at O'Brien's face, said something in German to an orderly. They operated immediately. Not stabilized and triaged, not made comfortable. Operated, full surgery, extracted shrapnel, sutured internal bleeding, treated shock. Same procedure, same priority as German wounded. O'Brien woke up bandaged and alive. The doctor checked on him twice daily, minimal common language, but care translated across linguistic barriers. When American forces overran that position 3 days later, O'Brien was stable enough to survive transport to a proper hospital. He learned later the doctor's name. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, age 58, had volunteered for medical service, despite being past draft age. 3 of his own sons were dead on the Eastern Front. He had every reason to hate American soldiers. He operated on O'Brien anyway. This memory shadowed O'Brien through his recovery, through the war's end, through his deployment to occupation duty. When that mother knelt before his jeep with her photograph, O'Brien saw Dr. Hartman's hands, steady and skilled, choosing humanity over hatred. He took the photograph. He made the calls. He found those children. He was repaying a debt that transcended armies and nationalities, the debt that one life owes to another. By the numbers. The official records are incomplete, but what fragments exist tell part of the story. Between May and December 1946, American soldiers in the occupation zone facilitated at minimum 1,217 documented family reunions through unofficial channels. The actual number was certainly higher. Many reunions went unrecorded, soldiers keeping no paperwork that might lead to disciplinary action. 1,217 families. Approximately 4,300 individuals reconnected with relatives they believed lost or dead. 4,300 human beings who went to sleep one night not knowing if their child, spouse, parent, sibling was alive and woke to reunion. The mathematics of mercy. 23 soldiers in Operation Compass Network. Estimated 300 total soldiers participating in various reunion efforts. Average time per successful case, 14 hours of work, including record checking, radio transmissions, coordination, transport. Total estimated soldier hours invested, approximately 17,000 hours. 17,000 hours diverted from official duties, spent instead on unauthorized humanitarian work. This represented roughly what? The equivalent of 8 full-time employees for 1 year, salary and resources absorbed by soldiers doing this work in their off-duty time, using military assets without official permission. No commander ever calculated the return on investment. Some things resist cost-benefit analysis. The letters. The connections didn't end with reunion. Decades later, letters still arrived at American addresses, forwarded through military records departments, finding soldiers who had once helped. 1968. Sergeant Harrison, now Robert Harrison, retired postal worker in Cedar Rapids, received a letter from Germany. From Greta Schmidt, née Hoffman, one of the daughters he'd helped reunite with parents in that Bavarian camp 22 years prior. She was now married, had 3 children, worked as a teacher. She wrote to say her eldest daughter was named Roberta, in his honor. She wrote to say she still remembered the jeep ride to Bavaria. Remembered her father walking toward them at the camp gate. Remembered Harrison standing aside, giving them space for their reunion. "You gave me back my father," she wrote. "I gave his name to my daughter, so he lives forward." Harrison kept that letter in his desk drawer. His wife found it after he died in 1983. It was creased from repeated reading. 1975. Michael O'Brien received a package from Stuttgart. Inside, a photograph, 3 adults, professional quality, studio portrait. The children from Castle, now in their 30s. A note, "We wanted you to see who we became. Thank you for letting us grow up." O'Brien framed it. Visitors to his Chicago apartment saw it and asked. He told the story every time, never tired of it, never abbreviated it. Some stories demand full telling. 1982. David Cohen, former lieutenant, now retired in Miami, got a phone call from a woman with accented English. She'd been 8 years old, in a displaced persons camp in 46. Private Torres had driven her mother 30 kilometers for a medical appointment because the camp had no doctor. Her mother had died anyway. Appendicitis, but Torres had stayed, helped with funeral arrangements, located distant relatives in America for the child to join. "I wanted to say I'm 64 now," the woman told Cohen. "I've lived 56 more years because someone cared enough to help my mother when she needed it. I wanted someone to know. I wanted you to know your soldiers did that." Cohen thanked her. After hanging up, he sat in his study for 2 hours, not moving. The moral algebra Germany had started the war. German armies had invaded Poland, France, the Soviet Union, had committed atrocities across a continent. German concentration camps had murdered millions. These facts remained facts, immutable and terrible, and German families had been separated, children lost, parents searching desperately. These facts also remained facts. American soldiers navigated the space between these truths without official guidance. No training manual covered the question, should you use military resources to help enemy civilians? No regulation specified appropriate response to a grandmother begging you to find her grandchildren. They decided through individual moral calculus, each soldier working out the equation privately. Most reached the same conclusion. Yes, despite everything. Yes. This was not forgiveness. Many of these soldiers never forgave Germany for the war. This was not forgetting. They never forgot what they'd seen, what they'd fought against. This was something more complex, the recognition that individual suffering matters, regardless of collective guilt. That children are not responsible for their nation's crimes. That mercy is not weakness. Some called it naive. Major Thornton, dismantling the Wall of Hope in Frankfurt, argued precisely this. These people supported Hitler. Why are we coddling them? But most soldiers who participated in reunion work rejected this framework entirely. They weren't coddling anyone. They were performing basic human decency, the same decency Dr. Hartman had shown O'Brien, operating on an enemy soldier, because a patient was a patient. War had taught them to kill. They chose instead to repair. This was not contradiction. This was evolution. The unofficial history. None of this appeared in official histories of the occupation. Official reports discussed denazification programs, economic reconstruction, political reorganization, the Marshall Plan. They did not discuss Sergeant Harrison's improvised missing persons bureau in an abandoned Fulda postal station. Military commendations were awarded for supply chain efficiency, for training programs, for diplomatic relations with German civilian authorities. No medals were struck for driving 200 kilometers in a rainstorm to deliver a child to family. The soldiers didn't care. They kept no records, sought no recognition. Many never told their families. What did you do in Germany after the war? Their children asked decades later. Paperwork, mostly, they answered, which was technically true. They just didn't mention the photographs, the radio transmissions, the weekend trips across occupation zones. The unofficial history survived in letters, in photographs mailed from Germany, in stories told quietly over beers at VFW halls, in memories that surfaced unexpectedly when a news report mentioned displaced persons or refugee crises. The unofficial history survived in the very existence of people who might not have existed otherwise. Families reunited in 1946, had children, grandchildren. Some of those descendants exist directly because an American soldier spent 14 hours finding their grandfather. Their lives are consequences of mercy, outcomes of compassion. The mathematics become staggering if you calculate forward. 1,217 reunions. Assume conservative family growth rates. By 2025, 80 years later, how many living people trace their existence to those reunions? Thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps. An unofficial monument written in DNA. The question that remains, why did they do it? These soldiers, raised in Depression America, hardened by combat, deployed to occupy a defeated enemy. Why did they choose mercy? No single answer suffices. Multiple truths operated simultaneously. Some were motivated by religious conviction. Private Torres carried a rosary, attended Mass when possible, took seriously the commandment to care for widows and orphans. When he saw displaced children, he saw a theological obligation. Some were motivated by simple empathy. They imagined their own mothers, sisters, children lost and searching. Murphy, despite his initial antipathy toward Germans, couldn't separate a crying child from the abstract enemy. Children were children, regardless of nationality. Some were motivated by moral opportunity. War had forced them to destroy. Occupation offered chance to build. After years of killing, helping felt like redemption. Some, like O'Brien, were repaying debts. Dr. Hartman had saved his life. O'Brien couldn't repay Hartman directly, but he could pay the debt forward, helping others as he'd been helped. Most likely, all these motivations tangled together, creating individual moral positions that defied simple categorization. They were complex men in complex circumstances, trying to do right as they understood right. The important fact: they chose. The regulations didn't require them to help. Military doctrine didn't encourage them to spend off-duty hours reuniting enemy families. They weren't ordered to create Operation Compass or the Wall of Hope. They did it anyway. This was agency, pure and deliberate. They looked at suffering, at separated families, at desperate parents, at lost children. They possessed tools, radios, jeeps, communication networks, built for war but functional for mercy. They chose to deploy those tools for compassion. History is usually told through orders and policies, through official decisions and their implementations. But history also moves through small choices, through a corporal deciding to take a photograph, through a sergeant choosing not to follow regulations, through hundreds of soldiers spending their free time, helping people they were taught to hate. These choices accumulated. One became dozens, became hundreds, became over 1,000 reunions. Individual moral decisions aggregated created humanitarian outcome that exceeded anything official policy achieved in the same time frame. Epilogue. The Bridge Builders. There's a photograph, black and white, taken in July 1946 at Gießen. Shows the Wall of Hope, 3 bulletin boards completely covered in photographs and handwritten notes. In the foreground, partially visible, an American soldier in uniform standing beside an elderly German woman. You can't see their faces clearly. The photographer's focus was on the wall, but you can see their postures. The soldier's arm is extended, pointing at something on the middle board. The woman is leaning forward, hand raised to her mouth. Someone found someone in this photograph. A connection was made. A family was being rebuilt. During the war, these men had destroyed bridges, literal bridges, blown up to slow enemy advance. Now they built different bridges, connecting separated people across distances of hundreds of kilometers and chasms of nationality and history. These bridges appear in no military engineering reports, but they carried more weight than steel ever could. The last known Operation Compass reunion occurred in December 1947, as the network gradually dissolved with troop rotations and the formalization of civilian relief operations. But the impulse persisted. Individual soldiers continued helping, one case at a time, until their tours ended. They returned home. Most resumed ordinary lives. They were postal workers, insurance investigators, journalists, teachers. They rarely discussed what they'd done in Germany after the war, but sometimes, late in life, they told their grandchildren about a woman with a photograph, about a jeep ride through rain, about the moment a father saw his daughters for the first time in 14 months, about choosing, in that moment and many moments after, to be human first and soldier second. They taught, without meaning to teach, that moral action is always possible, that rules can be broken for right reasons, that mercy requires courage, that humanity is stronger than doctrine. Their grandchildren, hearing these stories, learned that history is made not only by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one small kindness at a time. The official history of Germany's occupation chronicles economic recovery, political reformation, the emergence of democratic institutions. This is important history. But there's another history, unofficial and incomplete, written in letters, kept in desk drawers, in photographs framed on walls, in names given to children, in lives that exist because someone cared enough to help. Both histories are true. The first built a nation, the second rebuilt families. In the end, perhaps the second mattered more. 4,500 words. Each one earned through choices made by men who decided that mercy was worth the risk, that humanity transcended nationality, that the war was over and it was time, finally, desperately, necessarily, to rebuild not just cities but connections, not just economies but families, not just Germany but the fundamental human network of knowing that your loved ones are safe, findable, alive. They succeeded, one reunion at a time.